Hello, everybody. So, welcome back to today's afternoon session. In this session, Professor Tirthankar Raichaudhuri will be continuing on his discussions on 21 centimeter cosmology. So, once again, a very warm welcome to Tirth as well as to the participants. Over to you, Tirth.
Thank you, Supratik. So let me share the screen. Yes, I believe you can see the screen.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. So today is the third lecture of this series, and in terms of lectures, this will be the final lecture. The session we will have tomorrow will be another hands-on session. So today I want to go to the 21 centimeter signal part. So if you remember in the last lecture, I talked about epoch of reionization. And today I will spend some time on telling you how to detect this epoch of reionization, more details about it using upcoming experiments. So you remember this slide, I hope, from the previous lecture. What are the ingredients in studying reionization? And we said there is this dark matter aspect, dark matter halos where the galaxy is being formed. And then there is a galaxy formation aspect, things happening inside the galaxy. And that has roughly three parts. One is the formation of the stars, another is the spectra of these stars, and third is the escape of photons, ionizing photons from the host galaxy. And then there is the third aspect of the calculation, which has to do with the radiative transfer. And once you do these things, you need to calculate observables and do statistics to take it forward. So that is the basic idea about reionization, which we would like to understand. We also discussed briefly as to suppose you want to study the global reionization history. What do I mean by global reionization history? Suppose you want to study reionization, but in terms of globally averaged quantities. One of the very useful globally average quantities is the fraction of volume that is ionized, or fraction of mass that is ionized, whichever is relevant. We call it QH2. And we saw in the last class that QH2 is essentially driven by the number of photons produced. And the number of photons produced, we can model it using a parameter zeta and the evolution of the collapse fraction. And that collapse fraction will depend on the minimum mass of halo that can form stars and hence ionizing photons. We saw that very small mass halos cannot cool. Then there is a term, a compensatory term, which comes from recombinations. Recombinations inside the already ionized regions. And in this equation, things which are given in red can be thought of as free parameters of the model. So what you can do is, you can vary these free parameters and get for each of this set, you will get a reionization history. And then using that reionization history, you can compare with observables and then fix which of these parameters sets are allowed. Okay. Of course, what you can do is you can put it in some Bayesian analysis framework, for example, MCMC based, and work this out. Okay. So that's kind of routinely done. Once you, for example, calculate this ionized fraction, you can immediately find out what is this optical depth as measured in the CMB observations. You remember the optical depth was nothing but an integral over free electrons, and free electrons are essentially driven by this QH2 factor. So if you compare this expression with the expression I wrote in the last class, you will see I have replaced the free electrons by the average number of hydrogen times QH2. So whatever is the ionized hydrogen will also be the free electrons. There will be a small correction arising from helium, but that will be like 10%. So actual calculations account for that, but this is a simplified version of that. So this is one observational fact which you can compare with. There is another observational kind of evidence which is coming up, which is the redshift at which reionization ended. Okay, so the epoch when QH2 hits 1, for example. Then you can calculate ionizing emissivity. Ionizing emissivity is this quantity, which is the number of photons produced per unit time per unit volume. That is essentially basically this term, okay, times NH bar and so on. So once you do that, you can do many things which have to do with like globally averaged quantities. Okay, so these are like one number per redshift kind of a thing. Now, interestingly, what happens is this globally averaged quantities don't capture the full picture of reionization. So to make my point, what I have shown here are two movies. These are the slices which we have been showing since the last class. Slices of neutral hydrogen. In the left panel, I have used a model where reionization is driven by a lot of like faint galaxies. These galaxies are everywhere, they are abundant. Vis-a-vis a model where reionization is driven by a few number of very bright galaxies. I have tuned the efficiencies in these two models in such a way that both the models actually produce the same reionization history. That means all the quantities which I talked about in the previous slide will roughly be the same in these two models. So if you just talk about globally average quantities, you won't be able to distinguish between these two models. However, if you see actually the nature of reionization in these two models, you will realize that they are very different. The left-hand panel will actually show lots of small black regions. Black regions, remember, are the ionized regions. So in this part, you will see lot of small black regions. In the right-hand panel, you will see a very small number of big ionized regions. Okay. So the morphology of reionization is actually very different. Okay. So if I just, for example, stop somewhere here. Okay, let's see if I can stop it. No, it doesn't. So suppose, yeah, just trying. So if you just see somewhere, I'm just trying to get it in a way. If you just see somewhere here, you will see it is like the morphology of these two systems, two cases are very different. Okay, even though they have the same ionization history. And that is the point which is quite interesting. So that means there is a lot of information in the patchiness of reionization that cannot be captured just by calculating globally average quantities. Now, suppose we want to study this patchy reionization. Now, these much details where you can capture the patchiness and how these ionized regions are growing and so on. For that, you need to actually go to simulations. Okay, they cannot be really done analytically very easily. So one has to work out the radiative transfer part very accurately, because I mean, given a galaxy formation model, it's the radiative transfer which will tell you how these ionized regions are growing. And as we know that the ionized regions, their sizes and other things are driven by the kind of galaxies which are reionizing the universe. So there is some information there. I mean, if you just look at the sizes of the ionized regions, you probably will have some information about what kind of galaxies made those ionized regions. So now if you want to do simulations, so there are all these parts which you have to deal with. So if for the dark matter part, you will do n-body simulations, okay? Or I mean, you can do gravity only, the kind of simulations one usually does. or you can go to more sophisticated simulation by like SPH or hydrodynamic simulation. So these have the gas physics incorporated. Okay. So there are many examples. For example, there is a code called Gadget, which is publicly available. Then there is a code called ENZO. There is a code called Arepo, QP3M. All these are publicly available codes. So you can search and try to get it. Nowadays, if you don't want to run simulation, there are also data archives of simulations. Okay. And some of the famous ones are Illustris and then Cosmosim and so on. So in these cases, people have already run the simulations and made the data available publicly. So you have to just go and download the data. Of course, the data sizes are huge, so it often takes weeks to download depending on the kind of connection you have. But yeah. Then on top of that, you have to find, I mean, the density field is not enough. You have to also find the collapsed halos. And for that, you can incorporate some halo finder algorithms. For example, one popular halo finder algorithm is the friends of friends. Okay, so it finds the nearest neighbors of a particle, and if the nearest neighbor is within some distance, it actually puts them in a group and keeps on finding them till it finds a kind of isolated system where particles are close to each other. There are other ways to identify halos. One is called spherical overdensity. Then there are more sophisticated halo finding algorithms. For example, Rockstar. Again, this is a publicly available code. And it does a very sophisticated halo finding because it not only finds particles which are close to each other, it also uses the velocity information. Okay, so it actually really works out that which of the set of particles are not only close, but also bound. Okay, so their kinetic energy should be within the potential, less than the potential energy or whatever. Yeah, so the total energy should be negative. Then you have to also do star formation and escape of photons, but those are not real in cosmological simulations. Those are really not done in their full glory. So what you do is you again use simple assumptions, just like you will do in the analytical model. So there is no addition here if you try to do simulations. And then you have to do radiative transfer simulations, and that's where the challenge is. Now, radiative transfer simulation, you can do it in two ways. You can either run it along the cosmological simulation. So the cosmological simulation is running, and at each time step, you are also solving for the radiative transfer. But this is extremely expensive. Expensive means in terms of computational resources. Other option is to post-process. So you run the cosmology part, do the density field halo finding and keep it. On top of that, you run the radiative transfer simulation later. Okay, so this is called post-processing. So you are post-processing the density field later. Now, if you want to do radiative transfer like in its full glory, it is a really time-consuming thing. The problem is the dynamic range problem, because on one side you need to probe scales which are of the order of like half to 1 gigaparsec of that order. Okay, because you would like to probe a length scale which is comparable to what will be observed in the surveys. And also, if you want to account for the rarest of rarest sources, you need to go for these very large scales. But at the same time, you have to also make sure the smallest scales are also resolved. These would be the scale which are important for baryonic structure, known as the gene scale. And also, you need to find out the smallest halos which are there. So if you make the simulation too coarse, you won't be able to probe these small scales. Similarly, the time scales probed are also very different. For example, the star formation may happen in a million-year time scale, but the cosmological time scales can be billions of years. Okay, so which means you have to make sure that your time steps are also very fine. Okay, so that you don't miss any effect. So while doing your integrations, the time steps also has to be very fine. So you have to run for a longer time. Okay, so all these things make the radiative transfer simulations extremely challenging as well as compute intensive. So you cannot do radiative transfer very easily on a laptop or on a tutorial or whatever. So as I said, if incorporating full physics of reionization is so computationally expensive, how do we make forward? How do we go forward? So what we can do is we can try to do some kind of approximate and simple calculations which capture the essence of these things. So these radiative transfer simulations cannot be the only way to do these studies. You have to also find more efficient ways of like running these models again and again and again. Of course, the moment you go to simplified models, there is a disadvantage that you have to put in assumptions and approximations, because now you are not solving for all the equations in their full glory. Okay? So that leads to some fudge factors which you have to fix somehow and so on. So now it depends, depending on the problem you are solving and your approach, which of the two methods you will choose. Okay, or maybe you can choose something in between. In fact, I just wanted to highlight that the group, the 21 centimeter group in India, there are many codes developed, and three of them, and all three of them which I want to highlight are kind of simplified fast models. Okay, and they are quite useful. One is called Grizzly. It was developed by Raghunath Ghora when he was doing PhD in NCRA here with me. And then there was a code called Riyan Yuga that is currently maintained by Rajesh Mondal. This I will mention a bit about how this code runs, but this is also publicly available, so you can try to download. And then the third one is Script, which you heard about in the tutorial session, but don't know the details. So this is something me and my collaborators have developed and still are developing. Of course, it is publicly available. That's why you could download it in the last tutorial. So these codes are depending on your situation, you can now work out which one you want to use. Okay, and as I said, two of them are publicly available, so you can download and use them. Now, what is the idea behind developing these simplified fast models? In other words, how do we actually figure out a way to run them? So to do that, what we is first, let's assume there is a halo. Was there a question? Sorry, maybe not. So there is a halo, and what you can show, given the calculations we did in the previous class. Give me a second. That the number given a halo of mass m, if you work out the number of ionizing photons it produces, it's nothing but zeta times m with all these parameters put in. Okay, and of course you will be able to figure out why these parameters appear if you go back to the previous lecture and work out the mathematical steps. Okay. Of course, clearly not all halos will contribute to this. It is only halos above m min will give number of photons produced to be a non-zero value. So if m is less than m min, then of course we don't have to worry, it's zero. We will ignore recombinations for the time being. If we ignore recombinations, then the number of ionizing photons produced is equal to the number of atoms ionized. Okay, if you produce 36 ionizing photons, then there will be 36 atoms which will be ionized. Okay, and so on. Okay, you take any number. So there is no confusion there. Recombinations make it a bit complicated, because even if you produce 36 atoms, initially they may ionize 36. If you produce 36 ionizing photons, initially they may ionize 36 atoms, but then some of them will recombine. Okay, because there is a non-zero probability. So the numbers you have to then work out a bit more carefully. But if there are no recombinations, then it is just equal. Okay, so let us, for simplicity, work with this assumption. So now, if each of these halos produced a ionized region, which we can call H2 bubble. H2 is represents ionized hydrogen, and bubble is that region. Okay. The size of the bubble will be nothing but 4 pi by 3 r cube is the volume times the number density will give you the total number of hydrogen atoms. But you have to correct for the fact that this volume may not be having the same mean density. So you have to put in the extra density fluctuations on top of that. So these are the total number of hydrogen atoms within that volume, and that has to be equal to the number of photons produced by the source. Okay. Now, if you know the number of photons produced by the source, given this formula, you will be able to calculate the size of the ionized region. And this is trivial. I mean, you can understand this. Okay. This relation, you will realize, will be equivalent to saying that the dark matter mass contained within this region R will be equal to zeta times m. Okay, that is another way of putting it. So the dark matter mass of the ionized region is simply zeta times m. So that's the idea. Okay, this is just one halo producing one bubble. Okay, if the picture was so simple, then everybody could have just worked out the reionization history. One did not need any sophisticated codes. The problem is one source will produce one bubble, nearby source will produce another bubble, and these two bubbles will overlap. Okay, so you cannot just put like isolated spheres or whatever be their shapes everywhere and do with that. Okay, you have to account for these overlaps, and you have to now do something. You have to come up with a prescription which will tell you what would you do when the bubbles overlap. Okay, and that makes the whole calculation so difficult. Okay, the bubble overlap. This led to the idea of self-ionized regions. So what people realized is that you can think of a region just like you thought one halo, one surrounding bubble. You think of any region which is ionized, and inside that there are multiple sources. That means the bubbles have overlap. But you can say that this region is self-ionized because the number of photons produced by all the sources inside is like equal to or more than the number of hydrogen atoms present. Okay. So what you can do is, rather than thinking about one source and one bubble, you can think of one bubble containing many sources. And the condition for such a existence of such a region can be written like this. So what you say is, I will count all the halos I within that region R. I will count the total number of photons produced by all these halos, and they have to be greater than the total number of hydrogen atoms within that region. Okay. You can just manipulate this and you will be able to show that it is nothing but zeta times mass of all the halos divided by mass of this region must be greater than 1. Of course, mass within halos divided by the total mass is nothing but the collapse fraction. So zeta times collapse fraction needs to be greater than equal to 1. So if you find a region where the collapse fraction is greater than equal to 1 by zeta, you know that region will be ionized because of the sources within that produced there. Okay. Now, how will you implement it in a simulation box? And this is basically what you call excursion set models, and this is a very sophisticated way of doing things, but I will just give you a simplified version of that. So suppose somebody gives you a box with the density field and also the sources, okay, that is the halos, and within that the galaxies. Now suppose you want to ask, you divide the box into grids, okay, because that is how you will do your calculation, your numerical calculation. Now you go to any grid. I have just gone to the central grid for convenience. Now you ask the question, is this grid ionized or is this grid neutral? Okay. So suppose I give you the answer for this grid, then you go to the next grid and ask the same question. And if you have asked this question for all the grids and got the answer, then for every grid you know whether that is ionized or neutral. And if you know the answer for all the grids, then you have got your ionization map, because every grid will be ionized or neutral, and then it will, if you like visualize that, it will show up as ionization map. So basically, for every grid, you have to ask this question and find a way to answer it. How do you answer it? What you do is you go to the grid, you put a sphere. Let us say you start with a very large sphere. You ask the question, is this region, this large region, self-ionized? So which means, is zeta times the collapse fraction inside this region greater than or equal to 1? Okay. Maybe not. Then you actually go to a slightly smaller sphere. Keep on asking the same question. You keep doing it. Now, if at any spherical size, this condition is satisfied, you say that this cell is ionized, okay, because it has satisfied the self-ionization condition. This is essentially what is known as a barrier crossing problem. You are asking whether this barrier is crossed. Okay. Mathematically, you can show it to be a problem which can be mapped to the Brownian motion or diffusion problem. Although there is no diffusion really happening here, but mathematically it can be mapped to that. And there is a very nice mathematical way of doing these things. Now you ask this question. So if this barrier is breached for some radius, you mark it ionized. If it is not breached, you could have marked it neutral. But what is done is that you say that maybe it is not ionized, but it is not completely neutral. Maybe it's partially ionized. So in that case, what you do is you find whether there is a halo inside this cell, or there are halos inside this cell, and just put a ionized fraction which is equal to zeta times the total F collapse fraction inside the cell. That's it. Okay, so it's as simple as that. So this can be coded very easily, and this is what, for example, initially people did, and people worked out semi-numerical boxes. And when they took these semi-numerical boxes and compared with actual simulations, they found that the visually they look very similar. Okay, so one of these is a semi-numerical box, and one of these is a simulation, and you will see that they look very similar. So this was implemented first by these people, Messenger, Fullaneto, and Chen, in a code called 21 centimeter fast. But later on, this was like taken up by various other groups. For example, this is one work which is done by Shuman Majumdar et al. Shuman will be someone who will be, I think, taking lectures soon, this week. And here, what he did was, he actually compared it with full simulations, the ionization maps. So this row is a full radiative transfer simulation. This is coming from the semi-numerical excursion set model, and you can see they look very similar, although the semi-numerical model is much similar. Then, as I said, there is a code by Ian Yuga. So that is based on the excursion set algorithm, first developed by me and my collaborators in 2009, but then extended by Shuman in 2014, and now by Rajesh Mondal. So basically here, the density and halos are obtained using an n-body simulation, and then you apply excursion set. Okay, and these models allow extremely fast and efficient generation of ionization maps. Okay, so that is the basic idea. Now, these models would have been kind of extremely useful, because they allow you to get the ionization maps very quickly. They would have been extremely useful provided they did not have a very severe problem. Okay, and let me discuss that problem a bit. Now, suppose you did this calculation. I mean, you generate the ionization map. Now you ask the question, what is the total number of photons produced in the full simulation box? In the full simulation box, the total number of photons produced is number of halos produced in individual halos, and you sum over all the halos. Okay. And that you can show that this is nothing but sum over all the halo masses times this zeta and some scaling factors. But the total number of photons produced in the whole box should also be the total number of hydrogen atoms ionized, right? In absence of recombination, that is the approximation in which we are working. So the total number of hydrogen atoms inside the box you can show will be this, the total mass of the box and then everything else, okay? So the ionized mass fraction, if you just work out, will be equal to zeta times F collapse. Q should be equal to zeta times F collapse. This you could have guessed. Let me just, if I, since I have time, I can just, if you go back to this equation, you could have guessed from here also. Suppose I said there is no recombination. So think of this term not being present. Then dq dt is zeta times df collapse dt. So q will be zeta times f collapse. It's as simple as that, right? So if q is zeta times f collapse, this condition should be satisfied if photons are conserved properly. Okay, q should be equal to zeta times f collapse. Now what we did, I mean, this was known from the beginning, but me and Asim Paranjpe, we tried to do it more systematically. What is plotted here in the y-axis is zeta f collapse by q. Remember, if what I told you in the previous slide is correct, then this quantity should be 1. X-axis gives you the value of q. That means this is the stage of reionization one is talking about. Q equal to 0 is no reionization. Q equal to 1 is full reionization. These are for different kind of models and different kind of simulations. And you can see that although there are regions where this is exactly equal to 1, there are also regions where they deviate from 1. And the deviation, depending on the model, can be as low as a few percent, 5%, to somewhere around 10-11%. Of course, these are only for the models we have considered. Depending on the kind of models you would like to work with, one needs to check how much non-conservation does happen. Now, so you see a problem. This condition is not satisfied in the excursion set models. And it took us some time, and we realized that this is a very kind of, it's a problem with this kind of models. Okay, it will remain. I mean, we were able to show that. I won't have time to go into the technical details, but this is a problem, unfortunately. Now you can, I mean, for example, if the non-conservation was kind of extremely small, then we would have forgotten it. If it was a constant factor and independent of any details of reionization history, then also we would say, okay, fine, it is everywhere 5%, so let us give a 5% correction and be done with it. But unfortunately, it's not. I mean, it depends on which stage of reionization you are. It depends on what model you are using. It depends on what kind of box size you are using and so on. Okay. So it's not a very easy thing which you can easily correct for. I mean, so that makes the problem quite worse. And I like one now has to figure out a way to deal with it. Okay. We soon realized that there is another problem. So this is a slightly subtle problem, and let me see if I can explain it to you. Suppose you want to calculate the power spectrum. Okay, so the power spectrum you will calculate, and so now to calculate the power spectrum, if you remember our previous tutorial, of course we calculated the power spectrum for the density field, okay, dark matter density field. We did not talk about any ionization field, but let us think of that. To calculate the power spectrum, what did we do? We took the particle positions and then calculated the density field on a grid, okay, and then used that density field density field can be converted into density contrast. Then of course, it was not obvious from the code itself, but what we actually did was we took that density field, did a Fourier transform, and then mod squared it to get the power spectrum. Okay, so basically you need to get the density field. Now, the density field, what will you do with the density field now? To calculate the density field, there is a problem. Okay, there is not a problem, there is something which you have to decide. So let me just go back to this picture again. So suppose I want to calculate the density field, I will calculate the density field on a uniform grid. Okay, in 3D it will be a cubical grid. Now the question is, how small or large the grid size should I choose? Okay, there is no given number. Okay, so you will say that, okay, fine, I will choose a grid size which should be small enough. I mean, it will depend on the scales I'm willing to probe. Okay, so I can choose whatever grid size allows me to probe the scales I am interested in. So there is no unique answer to what grid size should you choose. However, there is one thing you should keep in mind. So just to give you an example, suppose you want to find the power spectrum at 50 H inverse megaparsec scale. Now, what kind of grid size would you choose? So I would say that you choose a grid size which is much smaller than 50 H inverse megaparsec, so that the size of the grid should not matter. So you may choose a grid size of 2 H inverse megaparsec or 5 H inverse megaparsec. The claim is that because you are studying the power at 50 H inverse megaparsec, whether you are choosing 2 or 5 should not matter. And that is what it should be. Like, suppose I'm only interested in large scales, why should I go and try to choose a very small grid size? Because anyway, I'm not interested in those grid sizes. Now, let us see in excursion set model what happens. So look at the right-hand curve. Right-hand curve is the power spectrum of neutral hydrogen, but I've just divided by the dark matter just for simplicity. So what has been plotted here is this ratio. And blue and red are what? Blue and red are curves plotted from two different kind of resolutions chosen. So in the blue one, I chose a resolution grid size of 10 H inverse megaparsec. Red one, I choose a grid resolution of 5 H inverse megaparsec. Suppose I'm interested at scales which is of the order of 50 H inverse megaparsec. Remember, K is inverse of length scale. So these are the large scales. Now the claim is that if I am interested in the large scales, the power at large scales, it should not depend on what grid size I chose. But it turns out that they indeed depend. Depending on whether you choose 5 H inverse megaparsec or 10 H inverse megaparsec, your power at much larger scales are different. Now this makes the problem very problem worse. So suppose I want to calculate power at 50 H inverse megaparsec, what grid size should I choose? Should I choose 5 or 10 or maybe even smaller, 2, 1, much smaller, what? Now that makes the problem worse. Okay, so now whatever you predict depends on what kind of grids you are choosing, and that is simply not going to work. I mean, for this kind of calculations, if you don't know what grid size gives you the correct answer. Okay, so this is a big problem with the excursion set models, and yeah, it leads to power spectrum which do not converge. Okay. So excursion set models are generally photon non-conserving, which I just discussed, and it leads to non-converging power spectra at large scales. And then it could, if you use this to interpret your data, you will be in big trouble. Okay. So you need photon conserving models to solve the convergence problem, because again, we could show that these two problems are related to each other. And that essentially led us to develop a completely new kind of code, which is the semi-numerical code for reionization with photon conservation, so SCRIP. And this uses a very different kind of algorithm. Okay. So again, I won't have time to go into the mathematical details of the algorithm, but the basic idea is you just first generate these bubbles around individual sources. Then what will happen is, if you do that, in the overlap regions, you will add the ionization fraction from both sides. And what will happen is, in the overlap region, you will end up with the ionization fraction which is larger than 1, which is unphysical. So what you do is, you treat this overlap regions as new sources of photons because they have excess photons, and then distribute them in the nearby cells. So this doesn't have the self-ionized region kind of concept of excursion set. They are photon conserving by construction. Okay, they are explicitly photon conserving, and they are reasonably fast. They are not as fast as the excursion set models, but they are reasonably fast, which you will see in the next tutorial as well, tomorrow's tutorial. And the moment we do it, something very interesting happens. That is, the power spectrum indeed converges. So again, concentrate on the right-hand panel. It is the same quantity plotted. Dotted lines are for the excursion set models. Remember, blue and red are for different resolutions. And the dotted lines you see don't match at large scales. Look at the solid lines. They are for the photon conserving model. And at large scales, you see the blue and red solid lines are on top of each other. At small scales, they are not on top of each other, because depending on whether you choose 5 or 10, that will affect the scales around 5 or 10 H inverse megaparsec, right? Because the 10 H inverse megaparsec don't know what is happening. I mean, the resolution of 10 H inverse megaparsec won't know what is happening at scales below that. It will predict wrongly, and so on. Okay. So at small scales, they will deviate. That is what we expect. But at large scales, they fall on top of each other. Now, this is good. Now, if you are interested in 50 H inverse megaparsec scale, you don't have to worry whether you should choose 5 or 10 or whatever. Okay. Whatever you choose, it will give you the correct result. And that is useful. Okay. So if you are really interested in large scales, you choose a very low resolution. If you're interested in small scales, you have to go to better resolution. It's as simple as that. Okay. And things will converge properly. So that is why we are now trying to understand the various aspects of this script, this model we developed. So it is very new, and we are still like trying to figure out its properties. And as I said, tomorrow's hands-on session will introduce you to this script, this code. Okay. In the ionization map aspect, you have already downloaded this code in the previous hands-on session, but that was to analyze the simulation data, the dark matter simulation data. Tomorrow you will actually see the ionization maps. Now, this kind of calculations, these ionized maps and so on, they can be very useful for studying reionization, in particular through 21 centimeter radiation. So what is 21 centimeter radiation of neutral hydrogen? So this is something you may have done in your quantum mechanics course. So imagine a hydrogen atom in the ground state. So there is an electron and there is a proton, and both of them are spin half particles. So both of them have spin. Now this spin can either be aligned in the same direction, or maybe they can be like in the opposite direction. Okay, misaligned or opposite basically. So depending on in which direction the spin is, there could be a slight difference in the ground state energy. Okay. This interaction between the photon and the electron spin is known as the hyperfine structure. Okay. Just like atoms have fine structure and so on, this is the hyperfine structure. And depending on how the spins are aligned, the energy can be slightly different. So if the atom goes from one state to the other, it may absorb or emit energy. So you know that if there are two spin half systems, you can build a triplet state and a singlet state and so on. So all these things are valid here. And then there are these energy differences between these two. So it turns out that if the atom goes from this state to that state, the spin flips and there is a photon which is emitted. This energy difference between the two levels correspond to a frequency of 1420 megahertz and a wavelength of 21 centimeter in the rest frame of the atom. So it's called 21 centimeter radiation, popularly. Clearly, this radiation is possible only when the hydrogen is neutral, because if the electron is not bound, and that too in the ground state, you won't see this radiation. I mean, this radiation cannot, this transition cannot happen. So this radiation is a direct probe of neutral hydrogen. This radiation is like routinely observed in our galaxy and nearby galaxies. But this radiation is so weak that it is very difficult to observe from distant universe. Okay? But also there is hydrogen is abundant, so one hopes that one should be able to observe them. We haven't observed the signal yet, we think, but there is a lot of effort being spent to observe this signal. Remember, if we can observe this signal, this will measure the neutral hydrogen content, and hence it will tell us about the epoch of reionization, because epoch of reionization, I mean, for all practical purposes, epoch of reionization has to do with how neutral hydrogen in the universe evolves. Now, how do we observe this signal? So observing this signal is slightly non-trivial. What you try to observe is a signal treating CMB as a background. So the idea is this: imagine CMB photons are coming, and CMB is a black body, so it has photons in basically every frequency, so to speak. Now, if in between these photons encounter neutral hydrogen, and if the photons actually have the correct frequency, that is 1420 megahertz at that redshift where it encounters neutral hydrogen, then what can happen is this neutral hydrogen can absorb photons of 1420 megahertz. Then what will happen is you will see a dip in the CMB signal because some photons are lost. Or depending on the state of the gas, it can add photons to the CMB radiation. Then you will see like a spike on top of the CMB radiation. So basically you will see either more photons or less photons than CMB. Sometimes you will see the same number of photons also. It will depend on the state of the gas. So you get some resultant, and that you observe, and that you observed at a frequency corresponding to 1420 megahertz divided by 1 plus z. This is the redshift factor, because the photons as they come to us will be redshifted. So depending on in which frequency you observe, you actually see the state of the universe at that redshift. Okay. So suppose you observe this at frequency 142 megahertz, that means Z is 9. So you are looking at the universe when its redshift, the corresponding redshift is 9. So reasonably early universe and so on. Okay. Now, whether it will absorb or not will depend on the level population. So there are two levels, singlet and a triplet. So depending on which one has more particles compared to equilibrium will give you whether you will see more radiation or less radiation. Okay, you can work out the transition rates. These are usually done by quantum mechanical calculation, and if you have done things like perturbation theory, Fermi's golden rule, transition probabilities and so on, you will be able to kind of work out these numbers. Essentially what happens is you calculate the N2 by N1 in the two level populations. That will be 3. 3 comes from the spin degeneracy, triplet to singlet, e to the power minus some quantity which you call T spin divided by T21. T21 is nothing but the temperature corresponding to the energy difference. Okay, so take the energy difference, equate it to KB times T, and that T will be T21. So spin temperature is nothing but the quantity that measures the level population. The signal observed will be the amount of neutral hydrogen present. Okay, so ionized hydrogen won't contribute. So if you may have a lot of hydrogen, but if everything is ionized, there won't be any 21 centimeter signal. So it will be proportional to neutral hydrogen present times 1 minus the CMB temperature divided by the spin temperature. Spin temperature basically tells you what the level population is. Now the spin temperature, depending on the state of the gas, can be colder than the CMB or higher than the CMB, hotter than the CMB. And depending on how the spin temperature behaves with respect to CMB, you will observe the signal either as a positive signal or a negative signal. Positive signal means you have added photons to the CMB. Negative signal means you have taken away photons from the CMB. So emission or absorption, you can think it that way. So this is basically the physics of the 21 centimeter signal. And you can see the spin temperature actually plays a big role in this. There are many observational probes of the 21 centimeter signal. Now, if I think of the 21 centimeter signal, I can firstly divide it into two broad areas. One is I can try to observe the global 21 centimeter signal. Global means it's a 21 centimeter signal, but globally averaged. Okay. That means I have to observe this signal from either the full sky or at least from a large region of the sky. Okay, so that is called a global signal. Else you can also try to observe the fluctuations in the signal. So here you are not just observing one number per redshift, but at a given redshift, you are also trying to observe the fluctuations. Now, within the global signal, what you can do is you can have experiments which will concentrate on the high redshift part, which is the cosmic dawn. Cosmic dawn means this is the time when the first stars are being formed, but the reionization hasn't started. Okay. And then you can also do observations at frequencies which will give you the signal during reionization. And there are various experiments which are going on, like EDGES, which actually has a claim detection of the signal, but it's not clear whether it is true or not. SARAS-2 is an experiment which is developed by RRI in India. And then there's LEDA and then the other experiments as well. The other option is to go to fluctuations. And fluctuations, there are again different regimes which you can try to detect. You can try to go to cosmic dawn, which is very low frequency early times. You can try to do it in reionization, which is the epoch we are interested in. You can also try to do fluctuations in the post-reionization universe. So I won't have time to go into the post-reionization universe, but what happens is in the post-reionization universe, you have neutral hydrogen within the galaxies. So what you can do is you can try to figure out a way to detect the signal coming from the galaxies using radio telescopes. I mean, by the way, all of you have realized by now that the kind of frequencies we are talking about low frequency radio telescopes. So these are all radio telescopes. So the telescopes which are trying to do these kind of detections are, for example, MWA in Australia, LOFAR in the Netherlands and Europe. GMRT is a telescope in India. It's like 80 kilometers from the place I'm sitting in now. And it is developed and maintained by the institute where I work. Okay, that's NCRA. Then there is CHIME in Canada and MEERKAT in South Africa. So these are a few, there are other telescopes as well. What you will realize is for detecting the global signal, you actually need very small, simple telescopes. For detecting the fluctuations, you need arrays. So if you can if you are able to see these photographs, you will see there are multiple telescopes which are there. Okay, it's not one small instrument. So that is why detecting fluctuations, it's a expensive thing, but fluctuations have so much information that people are trying to do this in so much details. And then I highlighted this part because this is where we will be concentrating. Okay, reionization, roughly talking about like hundreds to 200 megahertz. Okay. But as I said, there are other experiments and other kinds of things one can do as well. But as I said, we will talk about this only. Fluctuations in during the reionization era. Now, the 21 centimeter signal during reionization actually takes a very simple form. Remember, in general, the signal is proportional to the amount of neutral hydrogen present times 1 minus this TCMB by T spin. Okay. Now, during reionization, the T spin, that spin temperature, takes the value equal to the gas temperature, and the gas is heated up. It's the temperature of the gas is much hotter than the CNB. Okay, this is happening because of heating associated with reionization itself, and there could be some heating before reionization as well, which could be due to X-rays and so on. Now, if T spin is T gas and T gas is much greater than CMB, then you see this ratio TCMB by T spin goes to 0, and this factor just becomes 1. So the signal is essentially proportional to rho H1, okay, the amount of neutral hydrogen present. So you don't have to worry about any other complicated physics. You just have to think about the neutral hydrogen present in the universe. So that makes the calculations much simpler. During cosmic dawn, these conditions are not satisfied, so one has to actually calculate the spin temperature also. Only other complications that can arise are because of peculiar velocities and things like the evolution along the redshift direction. But those can be modeled and can be incorporated. But otherwise, things are very simple during reionization. If you want to understand the 21 centimeter experiments, their importance in the context of other experiments, firstly, you realize that the CMB, which also probes reionization history, it probes the integrated history. CMB photons are coming from the CMB surface to us, and whatever is happening in between is affects. And we are just observing the integrated effect. Okay. So as a result, often CMB probes are not very sensitive to the exact reionization history. Okay, because it's just the integrated number which we are calculating. The other experiment which we talked about is Lyman alpha absorption. Lyman alpha absorption is good because Lyman alpha is a line transition, so it can probe the signal at different redshifts. Okay, because line transition means the transition will happen at a particular frequency in the wavelength in the rest frame, and then because of redshift, you will observe at a particular wavelength on the Earth. The problem with Lyman alpha is that it's a very strong transition. And what happens is it's so strong that during the epoch of reionization, the signal essentially goes to 0. So you can only probe the end stages of reionization using Lyman alpha absorption. That is the problem. 21 centimeter radiation, on the other hand, is line transition. So that is why it is not probing, it is sensitive to the reionization history. It is not an integrated effect like CMB. But it is also weak, so that you can probe the signal even during the epoch of reionization. Okay? So it is ideal for reionization studies in that sense. So it is possible to probe this H1, the fluctuations in the neutral hydrogen density, using low frequency, this array of radio telescopes. These are called interferometers. Okay, so like GMRT is a low frequency interferometer, so are LOFAR, MWA, and so on. There are a lot of ongoing epoch of reionization surveys. For example, LOFAR and MWA are doing reionization surveys. HERA is something which is just coming up, like just few months old now. Then, of course, in the future, these will be done by a telescope called SK, the Square Kilometer Array. SK is very interesting and important for us because India is a member of the SK. SK is a multinational project, So it is being done by many countries because it's such a huge project. It cannot be just done by one country or one funding agency. India is part of one. India is one of those participating countries. And since India is participating, the hope is that once the SK becomes operational, we will have access to the data and then various other facilities related to the SK. So this is something you should maybe keep in mind, and this is something which will, I mean, many of you are students, and if you are interested in doing research in related areas, then by the time maybe you are peaking on your research and then things like that, doing your PhD, I don't know, SK will probably be coming up. So you may want to keep an eye on how SK is coming up and whether you will be interested in the data. And in India also, there are a lot of activities which are done on behalf of the SK. And again, if you are interested, you should check out some of these activities. Of course, for most of these instruments, the first target is to obtain the power spectrum. Power spectrum, as you know, we did it in the last class for the cosmological density field, but we can do it also for the neutral hydrogen field. And this is something which is observable. Okay, one can detect it from observations. That is the first target because that is most easy to observe. As the sensitivity of this telescope increases, what happens is we will be observing higher order statistics. So power spectrum is a 2-point statistics, the second order statistics. You can go and try to observe bispectrum, and then you can try to do more higher order statistics. There are more fancier way of characterizing these ionized regions using shape statistics. You can also try to make images of these things you observe and so on. The challenge which we are facing in detecting this 21 centimeter signal is that it is very weak. So what will happen is we have to collect a lot of data to make the signal above the noise. So we have to really deal with big data sets here. There's no other option. Then there are what we call astrophysical foregrounds, because many of the astrophysical systems, including our galaxy, actually emit at the frequency which we will be going to observe. So these are called foregrounds. So you have to identify these foregrounds and subtract them, and these foregrounds are often orders of magnitude larger than the cosmological signal. So that makes the whole thing very, very, very challenging. At the same time, from the theoretical side, you will have to make very accurate and efficient models so that you interpret the data correctly. Otherwise, yeah, you will have the data, but you won't understand anything about reionization and the early galaxies. This is a movie of reionization. This is obtained from this script. So this is, of course, the map as reionization progresses, what happens to the ionization structure. Okay, you will see all these black regions coming up, growing, overlapping, and so on. What has been plotted here is the power spectrum, okay, in units of millikelvin square, because we observe the signal in units of temperature. And you will see as the universe, the neutral hydrogen evolves, this power spectrum actually evolves. Okay, initially it remains the same for some time, then it tilts, okay, then it goes down, goes up, and then goes down, and finally it vanishes. It vanishes because everything gets ionized. Okay, so clearly how reionization progresses, that information is implicit inside this power spectrum. This lower plot is the power spectrum, but plotted in a different way. What I've done is I've chosen one length scale or one value of k, which is this line, and I have plotted the value as a function of redshift. And you can see in this region, the power spectrum actually evolves in a very specific way. It goes down, goes up, and then comes down. Okay, so it's there, goes down, it will go up, and then it will come down. Okay, and it peaks around a point where the universe is roughly 50-60% ionized. Okay, so that will be the point where we would like to observe the signal, because that is where the signal is maximum. Okay, if you see as a function of redshift, that will happen somewhere around redshift 7, between 7 and 6. Okay, so that is an extremely interesting experiment. Where are we now? Where are we now means, have we observed this signal, or how far are we? So to show that, what I've plotted here, and this is a figure I have taken from Leon Koopmans with some modifications I have made on top of that. These are basically where the observations are. Sorry, there's one thing. If you look at the, I've gone back to the previous slide. If you look at the signal in units of millikelvin square, you will see the typical strength of the signal is somewhere between 1 to 10 millikelvin square. Okay, so in millikelvin it is between 3, something like 3, few millikelvins. Okay, so that is the number to keep in mind. Now here you see these are the various observational data points, and they are talking about something like 10 to the 5, 10 to the 6 millikelvin square. These are essentially because there is still noise in the signal, so one hasn't observed them well enough to actually detect the signal. Okay, so the noise hasn't been reduced sufficiently, so one has to keep on observing for more and more. Different colors are from different experiments. Okay, so if you look at it, there is this point which is this greeny, there is this bluish point. This is coming from a paper in 2013, and it came from GMRT. In fact, GMRT was a kind of pioneer in this field. It actually gave the first kind of limits on the signal. What we now know is that the signal cannot be larger than this, because if the signal was larger than this, we would have already detected. It has to be smaller than this. So all these points, you should think of that the upper limit of the actual signal. So GMRT turned out to be one of the experiments which provided one of the first upper limits around redshifts of 9 or so. But then after that, many other experiments took over. So for example, MWA, then there was an experiment called PAPER, then LOFAR, and so on. And some of them did better than GMRT, some of them observed at higher redshifts and so on. So there are many experiments which came up and populated this plot. Okay, so that is something which is slowly becoming more and more interesting. Now, if we look at where state of the art where we are, this is, for example, the best limits we have from LOFAR. Remember, LOFAR is an experiment which is kind of which is in the Netherlands mostly, with some stations in Europe, okay, other countries in Europe. So basically a European endeavor, and so this is where the limits from LOFAR come. Then there is this Australian experiment, which is MWA, and MWA limits are sitting somewhere here. Okay, at a different redshift, but they are sitting somewhere here. These are also MWA, but they have been now bettered to somewhere here. Maybe the most promising limits at this moment come from this HERA. Okay, this is a paper which is like few weeks old. Okay, it's very recent. What you will realize is, as time is progressing, these limits are slowly coming down. Okay. For example, LOFAR, they have just analyzed 5% of their data. Okay. And in principle, if they can analyze the 100% of their data, LOFAR can reach a limit which will be somewhere here. Okay, roughly of the order of 10 millikelvin square. And remember, 10 millikelvin square is where we expect the peak of the signal to be. So what has been shown here by these dotted curves are typical theoretical predictions. Okay, And you have seen some of these predictions in my previous slide. So LOFAR may be able to come here, so will be MW and others, but they may not be able to really detect the signal. Okay, they may just be there, but conclusive detection may not be possible unless the signal does something which is unexpected. Okay, because now we are predicting something based on our current knowledge. Okay, but once the detection comes, it need not like match with what we expect, right? So it can be quite different, and that's something which is going to be very interesting. With SK, the noise limits will be somewhere here, depending on if you observe for 100 hours with SK, it will be here. If you observe with 1000 hours, it will be here. No matter what the case is, SK will be able to detect this signal. Okay, so SK, remember, is something which is going to come up, and India is part of it, and we are also part of the EOR group of the SK, and we will have kind of access to the data, maybe helping in interpretation and so on. So this is something one should really look forward to in the 21 centimeter field. This basically talks about the future interferometers. Interestingly, HERA is not more a future because it has already started producing results. Okay, so but it will have more data in the near future, so let it be here. But what will happen is with the SK, things will be like really revolutionary. SK, I forgot to tell you, SK will be built in 2 countries, one in South Africa, one in Australia. In South Africa, the part which will be built will be called SKA Mid. SKA Mid comes from the fact that it will be observing middle range frequencies. In Australia, the corresponding component will be called SK Low. So this is the Australian part. Low means low frequencies, and as you would have seen from the values, our interest, the EOR community, is mostly interested in the low frequency part. So that is why we will be like whoever is interested in EOR will be looking forward to the low frequency part. However, just give me a second, I want to tell you one more thing. However, this post-reionization signal, which is happening at slightly higher frequency, that will be done in the SK Mid part. Okay, so there will still be a lot of cosmology done with the SK Mid, the South African component. But as I said, since I'm concentrating on the low frequency EOR part, I'm talking about the SK Low. Okay, so SK Low will be made up of these dipoles, basically small dipoles, many of them, and these are quite small actually. If you see, I mean, this is a car and it's that height. So this is something you should be looking forward to, and particularly people who are interested in EOR physics. Again, let me emphasize that SK is probably coming up in a decade or so. The construction kind of, I mean, the processes have started, but the actual construction will take some time to start because of pandemic and other things. One really cannot even go to these sites now because of travel restrictions. But when that is done, the construction will start. And by the end of this decade, we will be starting, I mean, middle of this decade, we will be starting to have the initial kind of data. But to actually do your data, you may have to wait till 2029 and things like that. Okay, so you have to just wait till then. So that is something to really look forward to as far as the Indian community is concerned. So that essentially brings me to the end of this lecture. So let me just again try to highlight and summarize some of the main things. So 21 centimeter observations will actually open up a completely new window in studying the high redshift universe. It will also have potential synergies with other wavelengths. And that is something which I didn't talk about in great detail. What will happen is I mean, around the same time, if you remember the previous lecture, I told you there will also be the attempt to detect the first galaxies directly using other telescopes like the ground-based telescopes like the TMT 30-meter telescope, where again India is a part of that. Okay, so what will happen is, in principle, there will be a lot of synergies between these different experiments. Similarly, there will be a lot of new CMB experiments which will come up, and the CMB experiments will also have a lot of potential synergies with 21 centimeter. So the idea is one should be able to build a full picture using all these observations together. Okay, not one of them will be able to give you the full picture. You have to use all of them together to build the complete picture, and that's something to really look forward to. So in the 21 centimeter field, there are already kind of new and interesting results coming from the operating telescopes, MWA, LOFAR, and also Hera now. I mean, as I said, it's just a few weeks back. And one is really looking forward to the SK. Once the SK comes up, the field will be revolutionized. But even before that, we will have a reasonable idea about where the signal could be, or more importantly, what are the observational challenges, okay, which we need to make sure we understand. On the theoretical side also, there is a lot of work to be done, because what we need is, we just cannot, I mean, observationally we will have the data, but we have to complement that by very accurate and efficient theoretical models. So you can make accurate models, but if they are very slow, what will happen is you may not be able to probe the different models. Okay, so suppose a typical radiative transfer simulation nowadays take months to run. So you run one model, it runs for 2-3 months, and you see that model does not match the data. Then you fix some of these parameters, and then you run again. But you will be like, it will take years to figure out which model is correct. So you not only need accurate models, but you also need efficient models, which can be run in minutes and seconds. And then you can figure out which of the models is the correct model. So that will be like parameter estimation. So these will be extremely important if we want to interpret the observational data, because the data will have so much information. We have to really work hard to figure out which model is right. Okay, so I will stop here, and if there are questions or anything, I can take them up now.